In the arid land of Gilead, under a relentless sun, a figure emerges from the wilderness. This is Elijah, a man of fierce conviction and unwavering faith. His eyes scan the barren horizon, but his heart burns with purpose. Born in obscurity, Elijah is no king or nobleman, yet his calling is greater: to awaken a nation that has turned its back on God. The kingdom of Israel is mired in idolatry, worshipping Baal under the influence of King Ahab and Queen Jezebel. One evening, as the winds howls across the plains, Elijah feels the weight of his mission. "The Lord is God," he whispers, his voice firm. Little does he know, his journey will shape the spiritual destiny of a nation. Elijah strides boldly into King Ahab's court, the air thick with tension. Clad in simple garments, he is a striking contrast to the opulence around him. "As the Lord lives, there will be neither dew nor rain in this land except at my word," he declares, his voice cutting through the silence like a blade. The courtiers murmur in disbelief, and Ahab's face contorts with anger. But Elijah stands firm. This proclamation of drought is not merely a warning, it is a divine judgment against the rampant idolatry in Israel. Without another word, Elijah turns and walks away, leaving a stunned court behind. Enjoying the story? Like, subscribe, and share to support us. Let's continue. With the king's wrath looming, Elijah retreats to the wilderness, following God's command. At the brook Chariot, he finds refuge. By day, he drinks from its crystal-clear waters, and by night, he marvels as ravens bring him bread and meat. The solitude sharpens his faith, but as weeks turn to months, the brook begins to dry. Elijah watches the dwindling stream, knowing his time here is ending. God's provision sustains him in this desolate place, a sign of the miraculous care that will follow him. Directed by God, Elijah travels to Zarephath, where he encounters a widow gathering sticks. Her face is etched with worry as she tells him of her plight. A handful of flour and a little oil are all that remain. "Do not be afraid," Elijah reassures her. "Make me a small loaf first, and the Lord will ensure your flour and oil will not run out until rain returns to the land." Hesitant but hopeful, she obeys, and the miracle unfolds as promised, sustaining her household throughout the famine. Tragedy strikes when the widow's son falls ill and dies. Overcome with grief, she confronts Elijah, questioning if his presence has brought God's judgment upon her. Moved deeply, Elijah takes the boy to an upper room and prays fervently, laying himself over the lifeless child. "O Lord, let this child's life return to him," he cries. Suddenly, the boy breathes again. Elijah carries him back to his mother, and her tears of sorrow turn to joy. "Now I know you are a man of God," she declares, her faith renewed. The drought tightens its grip on the land, and famine spreads. Fields lie barren, rivers dry up, and the cries of the hungry rise. Meanwhile, Jezebel's persecution of God's prophets intensifies. Despite the desolation, Elijah's faith remains unshaken. He continues to wait for God's instruction, knowing the next step in his mission will demand even greater courage. God sends Elijah back to confront Ahab. On the way, he meets Obadiah, a faithful servant of the Lord who has been hiding prophets from Jezebel's wrath. "Tell Ahab I am here," Elijah commands. Obadiah trembles with fear, knowing the danger of such a message, but Elijah reassures him. Obediently, Obadiah delivers the message, setting the stage for one of Elijah's greatest confrontations. On Mount Carmel, Elijah challenges the prophets of Baal to a spiritual duel. Before a vast crowd, he proposes a test. 2 altars will be prepared, one for Baal and one for the Lord, and fire from heaven will prove the true God. The prophets of Baal cry out all day, cutting themselves in frenzied desperation, but no fire appears. Elijah mocks them, saying, "Perhaps your God is sleeping." The crowd begins to doubt, their faith shaken. As the sun begins to set, Elijah rebuilds the altar of the Lord using 12 stones, representing the tribes of Israel. He drenches it with water 3 times, ensuring no fire could ignite by natural means. Stepping forward, he prays, "Answer me, O Lord, so these people may know you are God." Fire descends from heaven, consuming the sacrifice, stones, and water. The crowd falls to their knees, crying, "The Lord, He is God." In the aftermath of the miracle, Elijah commands the people to seize the prophets of Baal. They are taken to the Kishon Brook and executed, symbolizing the nation's rejection of idolatry. As the smoke clears, Elijah kneels and prays for rain. A small cloud appears on the horizon, growing rapidly until a torrential downpour engulfs the land, ending the drought. Jezebel, enraged by the slaughter of Baal's prophets, sends a message to Elijah. "By this time tomorrow, you will be like one of them." Overcome by fear, Elijah flees for his life into the wilderness. He travels deep into desolation until exhaustion overtakes him. Collapsing under a solitary broom tree, Elijah prays for death. "I have had enough, Lord," he whispers. "Take my life. I am no better than my ancestors." As he sleeps, an angel appears, touching him gently and offering bread and water. The angel returns a second time, urging him to eat, saying, "The journey is too much for you." Strengthened by this divine provision, Elijah sets out for Mount Horeb, traveling 40 days and 40 nights through the barren land. At Mount Horeb, Elijah finds shelter in a cave. The silence around him is deafening, mirroring the turmoil in his heart. God speaks, "What are you doing here, Elijah?" The prophet pours out his anguish, saying, "I have been zealous for the Lord, but the Israelites have rejected your covenant, torn down your altars, and put your prophets to death. I am the only one left, and now they seek my life too." God commands him to stand on the mountain. A fierce wind tears through the rocks, an earthquake shakes the ground, and fire roars across the peak. But the Lord is not in these. Then comes a gentle whisper. Elijah covers his face, recognizing the presence of God, and listens as God gives him a new mission. God instructs Elijah to anoint Hazael as king of Aram, Jehu as king of Israel, and Elisha as his prophetic successor. He assures Elijah that 7,000 in Israel have not bowed to Baal or kissed him, a reminder that he is not alone. Buoyed by this divine reassurance, Elijah descends the mountain with renewed purpose. The wilderness stretches before him, but his steps are steadier now, his faith strengthened. The weight of his mission remains, but so does the promise of God's presence. Elijah finds Elisha plowing a field with 12 oxen, working diligently. Without a word, Elijah approaches and casts his mantle over Elisha's shoulders. Startled, Elisha stops his work, realizing the significance of the gesture. "Let me bid farewell to my parents," Elisha pleads, and Elijah permits him. Elisha sacrifices the oxen and burns the plowing equipment, symbolizing his total commitment to his new calling. The villagers watch in awe as he leaves everything behind to follow Elijah. Elijah and Elisha journey together, visiting schools of prophets in Bethel and Jericho. At each stop, the sons of the prophets warn Elisha, "Do you know the Lord will take your master today?" "I know," Elisha replies, "but be silent." Elisha's resolve grows with every step. Though the others cannot comprehend it, he knows his place is by Elijah's side until the very end. The bond between the two prophets deepens, marked by mutual respect and shared purpose. The two arrive at the Jordan River, where Elijah takes his mantle, rolls it up, and strikes the water. To the astonishment of onlookers, the river parts, allowing them to cross on dry ground. Elisha, walking in Elijah's shadow, feels the gravity of the moment. "Ask what I shall do for you before I am taken," Elijah says. Elisha replies, "Let me inherit a double portion of your spirit." Elijah smiles and responds, "You have asked a hard thing, but if you see me when I am taken, it shall be so." As they walk beyond the Jordan, the air becomes charged with an otherworldly energy. Suddenly, a chariot of fire and horses of fire appear, separating Elijah from Elisha. Elijah is swept up in a whirlwind and ascends into heaven, leaving Elisha staring upward, overcome with awe and sorrow. My father, the chariots of Israel, he cries out, tears streaming down his face. Elijah is gone, but his mantle lies on the ground, a symbol of the prophetic legacy now passed on to Elisha. Elisha picks up Elijah's mantle and walks back to the Jordan River. Striking the water as Elijah had done, he calls out, "Where is the Lord, the God of Elijah?" The waters part once more, confirming that Elijah's spirit now rests on him. The sons of the prophets watching from a distance exclaim, "The spirit of Elijah rests on Elisha." Though filled with grief for his mentor, Elisha steps forward, ready to begin his ministry. Elisha begins his ministry with a miracle, purifying a spring in Jericho. The water, once bitter and undrinkable, becomes sweet and life-giving after Elisha adds salt. The people rejoice, realizing God's power is now working through this new prophet. News of the miracle spreads quickly, affirming Elisha's role as Elijah's successor. As Elisha continues his journey, a group of mocking youths jeer at him, calling him Baldy. Their disrespect provokes Elisha to call upon the Lord. 2 bears emerge from the forest and attack the mockers, leaving the rest fleeing in terror. The event serves as a reminder that God's prophets are to be treated with reverence, and that actions have consequences. Elisha's ministry expands as his reputation grows. One day, a widow of a prophet approaches him, pleading for help. Her husband's debts have left her, and her 2 sons at risk of enslavement. Elisha instructs her to gather as many empty jars as possible and pour her last bit of oil into them. Though skeptical, she obeys. Miraculously, the oil continues flowing until every jar is full. "Sell the oil to pay your debts and live on the rest," Elisha tells her. The woman leaves, filled with gratitude for the provision of God, realizing his care extends even to the smallest details of life. Elisha becomes a frequent guest at the home of a wealthy Shunammite woman and her husband, who build a small room on their roof for him. Moved by their kindness, Elisha prophesies that the barren woman will bear a son. A year later, her joy is complete as she holds her newborn child. However, tragedy strikes when the boy collapses in the fields years later and dies in her arms. In despair, the woman places the boy on Elisha's bed and sets out to find the prophet, refusing to accept her loss. The Shunammite woman reaches Elisha and falls at his feet, her grief spilling out in sobs. Elisha immediately returns with her to the house. He goes to the boy's room, shuts the door, and begins to pray. Stretching himself over the lifeless child, Elisha prays with fervor. The boy's body warms, and after a second attempt, the child sneezes 7 times and opens his eyes. Elisha calls for the mother, who falls to her knees in gratitude. This miracle cements Elisha's role as a bearer of God's life-giving power. During a famine, Elisha instructs his servant to prepare a stew for the prophets. Unknowingly, wild gourds are added to the pot, poisoning the food. When the prophets taste it, they cry out, "There is death in the pot." Elisha calmly takes some flour, throws it into the stew, and declares it safe. The prophets eat without harm, marveling at how God works even in the face of danger. A desperate Naaman, a commander in the Syrian army, seeks Elisha's help for his leprosy. Elisha sends a simple message: "Wash 7 times in the Jordan." At first, Naaman is insulted by the prophet's lack of grandeur and refuses, but his servants convince him to obey. Reluctantly, Naaman dips himself in the muddy river. On the 7th time, his skin is restored, smooth as a child's. Overwhelmed, Naaman returns to Elisha, proclaiming, "Now I know there is no God in all the earth except in Israel." Gehazi, Elisha's servant, secretly pursues Naaman after he departs and deceitfully asks for gifts on Elisha's behalf. Gehazi hides the treasures, but is confronted by Elisha, who reveals that he knows of the betrayal. "The leprosy of Naaman will cling to you and your descendants forever," Elisha declares. Gehazi's skin turns white with leprosy, a sobering reminder of the consequences of greed and deceit. Elisha's fame reaches new heights when he miraculously feeds 100 men with just 20 loaves of barley bread. As the bread is distributed, it multiplies, leaving leftovers even after everyone is satisfied. The men are astonished, and Elisha's words echo, "The Lord has said, they will eat and have some left over." This act solidifies Elisha as a channel of God's provision, even in times of scarcity. During a siege on Samaria, famine drives the city to the brink of despair. Elisha prophesies that by the next day, food will be plentiful. Skeptics scoff, but as dawn breaks, the enemy camp is found abandoned. God had caused the Arameans to flee in terror, leaving behind supplies. The starving city rejoices as they plunder the enemy's goods, fulfilling Elisha's prophecy. As Elisha nears the end of his life, King Joash visits him, weeping for the future of Israel. Elisha instructs him to shoot an arrow out of the window and declares it the arrow of victory over Aram. Then he tells the king to strike the ground with arrows. Joash strikes only 3 times and stops. Elisha grows angry, saying, "You should have struck 5 or 6 times. Now you will defeat Aram only 3 times." The moment underscores the importance of complete faith and effort in following God's instructions. Even in death, Elisha's influence persists. A group of men burying a body are startled by a band of raiders. In their haste, they throw the corpse into Elisha's tomb. When the body touches Elisha's bones, the man comes back to life. This final miracle stands as a testament to the enduring power of God working through his prophet, even beyond the grave.